something begins to loosen its grip when the most important phase of life approaches, and it rarely announces itself with certainty or direction. What is first noticed is a quiet loss of orientation, as though the inner compass no longer responds to familiar landmarks. Goals that once generated movement now produce indifference. Decisions that once felt natural now feel strangely foreign. One moves through the day, yet without the sense of arriving anywhere. This is not confusion in the ordinary sense, but a deeper disturbance, a signal that the psyche has begun to withdraw allegiance from a form of life that once held it together. At this stage, many attempt to correct the disturbance by doubling effort or restoring old certainties. Yet nothing responds as it once did. The individual experiences an inner resistance that cannot be overcome by will, as though the ground itself has shifted beneath habitual steps. There is often a subtle fatigue that sleep does not repair, a dull pressure behind the eyes or a tightening in the chest that appears without clear cause. These are not failures of discipline, but signs that the inner economy has altered. The psyche has begun to demand something that conscious intention does not yet understand. This moment has been observed repeatedly in analytical work, and Carl Jung recognized it as the beginning of a decisive psychological reorganization rather than a collapse of character. What disorients the individual is not the loss of capacity, but the loss of relevance of the old orientation. Former motivations no longer carry psychic energy. Roles that once provided identity now feel mechanical. One continues to perform them yet without inner participation. This creates the peculiar tension of outward functionality combined with inward withdrawal, a condition that is often misinterpreted as depression or loss of purpose, when it is in fact a threshold state. What makes this phase dangerous is not its discomfort, but the fact that it cannot be resolved by regression. The psyche does not relinquish an old structure unless it has exhausted its usefulness. At this point, many retreat, constructing substitutes for direction through distraction, stimulation, or borrowed urgency. They mistake motion for movement and noise for meaning. The inner demand is silenced temporarily, but the cost is severe. When this threshold is avoided, the result is not stability, but a slow stagnation that hardens into lifelong dissatisfaction and unlived potential. Disorientation, therefore, is not random. It is the psyche's first unmistakable signal that the former form of life can no longer contain what is developed within. The individual may experience this as an inner emptiness, yet this emptiness is not absence but pressure without shape. Something seeks expression but cannot yet be named. The old language fails, the old images collapse. This produces anxiety not because something is wrong, but because the conscious mind is no longer in command of direction. Control has shifted inward, beyond immediate comprehension. Carl Jung described this condition as one in which consciousness has reached the limits of its previous adaptation. The familiar map dissolves, and with it dissolves the illusion that life progresses through linear accumulation alone. At this point, the psyche no longer responds to ambition, approval, or external success in the same way. Energy turns inward, not by choice, but by necessity. Attempts to force clarity at this stage only deepen the confusion, because clarity belongs to the next phase, not this one. The most telling feature of this stage is the quiet sense that returning to what once worked is no longer possible. Even if the individual attempts to restore former identities, something within refuses to cooperate. The body resists, emotions flatten, satisfaction does not return. This resistance is not stubbornness, but intelligence. The psyche protects its future development by making regression intolerable. What feels like loss is actually a narrowing of options, guiding the individual toward an unavoidable inner reckoning. Those who endure this phase without prematurely resolving it begin to notice a subtle shift in their relationship to uncertainty. Anxiety gives way to gravity. Questions replace complaints. There is less urgency to explain oneself and more attention to what cannot yet be articulated. The individual stands, often alone, between what no longer functions and what has not yet appeared. This is the psychological position from which transformation becomes possible, but only if the discomfort is permitted to exist without immediate interpretation or escape. Disorientation is the psyche's first signal that the old form of life has exhausted its purpose. As the disorientation persists, a more concrete change begins to assert itself, and it is felt not only in thought, but in the body and in daily effort. What once could be sustained through discipline now requires disproportionate force. Tasks that were formerly routine become heavy. Relationships that once felt mutual now feel draining. There is an unspoken resistance to continuing in the same way, accompanied by a fatigue that carries a distinctly psychological weight. This fatigue is not the result of excess activity, but of activity that no longer corresponds to inner necessity. At this stage, the individual often attempts to compensate by refining old strategies, believing that the problem lies in execution rather than orientation. More structure is imposed, more obligations are accepted. Yet the more one tries to maintain the former adaptation, the more the inner resistance intensifies. The body begins to signal its refusal through tension, shallow breathing, disrupted sleep, or a persistent sense of being pressed forward without conviction. The psyche is no longer willing to finance a way of life that has become obsolete, and it expresses this withdrawal through exhaustion. Carl Jung observed that when psychic energy withdraws from established structures, those structures do not collapse immediately, but become hollow. One may still occupy the same position, maintain the same routines, and speak the same language, yet without the inner participation that once animated them. This creates a peculiar state in which life appears intact from the outside, while inwardly it feels strangely unreal. The individual is present but not invested. Effort continues, but meaning does not return. This is not failure, but a signal that the psyche has already moved on. Relationships are often the first to reveal this shift. Conversations repeat themselves without depth. Familiar dynamics feel intolerable rather than comforting. There may be a growing impatience with expectations that once felt reasonable. The individual notices a reluctance to explain, justify, or maintain appearances. This withdrawal is frequently misread as selfishness or emotional coldness, yet it arises from a deeper necessity. The psyche can no longer disperse its energy outward in the same way, because it requires that energy for an internal reorganization that has already begun. Ambitions, too, lose their former authority. Goals that once provided direction now feel strangely empty, even when they are achieved. The satisfaction they offer is brief and superficial. One may succeed outwardly while feeling inwardly diminished. This creates confusion, because the conscious mind has been trained to equate progress with accumulation and advancement. When advancement no longer satisfies, the individual assumes something is wrong, rather than recognizing that the psyche has altered its criteria for value. Carl Jung understood this phase as the collapse of an old adaptation, not through catastrophe but through attrition. The psyche does not destroy what it can simply abandon. It removes energy quietly, allowing former structures to decay from within. What collapses is not life itself, but the way life has been organized. The individual experiences this as a loss of effectiveness. Yet this loss is intentional. It prevents further investment in a form that can no longer support growth. The bodily consequences of this withdrawal are often subtle but persistent. There may be a chronic tightness in the chest, a sense of being constantly braced, or an exhaustion that does not correspond to physical exertion. Appetite for former rewards diminishes. Pleasure becomes muted. These sensations are not symptoms to be eliminated, but messages to be interpreted. The body registers the misalignment before the mind can formulate it, because the body participates directly in the psyche's economy of energy. As the old adaptation collapses, the individual is tempted to interpret the experience as regression or decline. This interpretation is understandable yet inaccurate. What is actually occurring is a conservation of energy. The psyche is reclaiming resources from outdated commitments in preparation for a new configuration that has not yet become conscious. This interval feels barren because it is transitional. The psyche has withdrawn from what was, but has not yet revealed what must be. Carl Jung emphasized that this phase cannot be shortened by force, nor avoided without consequence. Attempts to override the withdrawal through stimulation, distraction, or compulsive productivity only deepen the exhaustion. The psyche responds by increasing resistance until compliance becomes impossible. This is not punishment but regulation. The individual is being compelled to relinquish an identity that has completed its task, whether the conscious mind agrees or not. When energy withdraws from a way of life, no amount of effort can make it vital again. When the old adaptation has finally lost its hold, something quieter and more insistent begins to make itself felt. It does not arrive as enthusiasm or vision, but as an inward pressure that cannot be ignored. The individual senses a direction without being able to name it, a gravity that pulls attention away from former compromises. There is less anxiety now, but more seriousness. The psyche no longer negotiates, it begins to require. This requirement does not speak in arguments or ideals. It manifests as a refusal to continue certain conversations, a refusal to pursue certain ambitions, a refusal to explain oneself in ways that once felt necessary. The individual notices that some choices have become impossible, even when they appear reasonable on the surface. This impossibility is not moral, it is psychological. The psyche has identified what can no longer be lived without damage. At this point, effort changes its character. There is still fatigue, but it is no longer diffuse. Energy gathers around specific tensions. One feels compelled toward certain thoughts, certain forms of solitude, certain unfinished inner tasks. There may be a recurring image, a persistent question, or an unrelenting dissatisfaction with superficial answers. These are not obsessions, but signals of orientation. The psyche is beginning to organize itself around a deeper necessity. Carl Jung described this as the emergence of an inner law that supersedes conscious preference. It does not consult the ego's plans or ambitions. It asserts itself through repetition and pressure, until resistance becomes more costly than compliance. The individual realizes that returning to the former life is not merely undesirable, but impossible. Something essential has been withdrawn, and no substitute can replace it. This stage often brings a strange calm alongside its gravity. The individual may still feel uncertain, but the frantic search for reassurance subsides. Anxiety gives way to a sober recognition that something must be faced. The psyche no longer tolerates distraction. It demands attention, not through excitement, but through insistence. Silence becomes necessary. Solitude becomes meaningful. The inner world begins to carry more weight than external validation. What distinguishes this phase is that choice narrows rather than expands. Freedom is no longer experienced as endless possibility, but as obligation to what has revealed itself as unavoidable. The individual may grieve the loss of alternatives, yet there is also relief in this narrowing. The psyche prefers necessity to chaos. Once necessity appears, anxiety loses its function, because the direction is no longer optional. Carl Jung observed that this inner necessity often contradicts social expectations and personal history. It may require withdrawal from roles that once defined the individual. It may demand the abandonment of ambitions that were built over years. This produces tension because the ego experiences the demand as unreasonable, yet the psyche does not negotiate with history. It orients toward wholeness, not continuity. The seriousness of this phase lies in its irreversibility. Once inner necessity has emerged, it cannot be silenced permanently. One may delay action, but the pressure does not dissolve, it intensifies. The individual senses that time itself has changed character. What was once postponable now carries consequence. What is avoided begins to exact a price in the form of stagnation, bitterness, or psychic deadening. Inner necessity emerges when the psyche no longer accepts compromise with what is false. When inner necessity has made itself unmistakable, the psyche no longer tolerates delay. What remains is not the question of whether to change, but whether one will assume responsibility for the change that has already begun. At this stage, the individual discovers that explanation no longer satisfies and reassurance no longer helps. The pressure now demands commitment, not understanding. Life begins to reorganize around what must be lived, rather than what can be justified. Commitment here does not mean certainty or confidence. It means alignment. The individual begins to act in accordance with the inner demand, often without external validation and sometimes in direct conflict with previous loyalties. This produces fear, but it is a different kind of fear. It is no longer the fear of confusion, but the fear of consequence. One senses that refusing this movement will exact a cost that cannot be avoided indefinitely. The psyche has already calculated this cost. Carl Jung observed that at this point the individual often attempts a final negotiation, hoping to preserve fragments of the old life alongside the new necessity. These compromises rarely succeed. The psyche does not accept partial compliance. It requires a restructuring of priorities, relationships, and self-concept. What cannot be integrated must be relinquished. This is experienced not as cruelty, but as precision. The psyche is exact in what it demands, because it is oriented toward wholeness rather than comfort. As commitment deepens, the individual may notice an unexpected stabilization. The body begins to respond differently. The chronic tension eases, even though uncertainty remains. Sleep becomes deeper. Breath settles. There is less inner noise. This does not occur because the future is secure, but because the psyche recognizes that its directive is being honored. Energy returns, not in excess, but in coherence. Life feels narrower, yet more real. This phase cannot be delegated. No one can live it on behalf of another. Advice becomes largely irrelevant, because the directive arises from within and must be answered from the same place. Carl Jung emphasized that this is why genuine transformation often appears lonely. The individual is no longer primarily oriented toward adaptation to the collective, but toward fidelity to an inner law. This does not produce isolation by intention, but it does alter one's relationship to belonging. What becomes clear now is that refusal is no longer neutral. To avoid this commitment is to choose a different outcome entirely. The psyche responds to refusal not with renewed confusion, but with constriction. Life becomes smaller, possibilities close, emotional range diminishes. One may function, but without depth or vitality. This is not punishment, it is consequence. The psyche cannot sustain vitality in a life that contradicts its own development. Responsibility in this phase is not moral responsibility in the conventional sense. It is existential responsibility. The individual is accountable not to an external authority, but to the fact of what has emerged within. To deny it is to fragment oneself. To accept it is to bear the weight of one's own becoming. This weight is heavy, yet it brings a peculiar dignity. One stands under necessity rather than opinion. Carl Jung understood that this is the moment when a life either consolidates around its essential direction or dissipates into repetition. There is no dramatic finale, there is only the quiet establishment of a new form of life built around what cannot be undone. The psyche does not ask whether one is ready. It proceeds according to its own law. Readiness is irrelevant. Response is everything. The final truth of this phase is simple and severe. What has begun cannot be reversed without cost. What has been demanded cannot be ignored without consequence. The psyche moves forward, whether accompanied consciously or not. To commit is to participate in one's own transformation. To refuse is to be carried by it in diminished form. What the psyche demands must be lived, or it will be suffered.